The Pied Piper. Newtown, or Franchville as 'twas called of old, is a sleepy little town, as you all may know, upon the Solent shore. Sleepy as it is now, it was once noisy enough, and what made the noise was rats. The place was so infested with them as to be scarce worth living in. There wasn't a barn or a cornrick, a storeroom or a cupboard, but they ate their way into it. Not a cheese but they gnawed it hollow. Not a sugar puncheon but they cleared out. Why, the very mead and beer in the barrels was not safe from them. They'd gnaw a hole in the top of the tun, and down would go one master rat's tail, and when he brought it up, round would crowd all the friends and cousins, and each would have a suck at the tail. Had they stopped here, it might have been borne, but the squeaking and shrieking, the hurrying and scurrying, so that you could neither hear yourself speak nor get a wink of good honest sleep the livelong night, not to mention that mamma must needs sit up and keep watch and ward over baby's cradle, or there'd have been a big ugly rat running across the poor little fellow's face and doing who knows what mischief. Why didn't the good people of the town have cats? Well, they did, and there was a fair stand-up fight, but in the end the rats were too many, and the pussies were regularly driven from the field. Poison, I hear you say? Why, they poisoned so many that it fairly bred a plague. Rat catchers? Why, there wasn't a rat catcher from John O'Groat's house to the land's end that hadn't tried his luck. But do what they might, cats or poison, terrier or traps, there seemed to be more rats than ever, and every day a fresh rat was cocking his tail or pricking his whiskers. The mayor and the town council were at their wits' end. As they were sitting one day in the town hall, racking their poor brains and bewailing their hard fate, who should run in but the town beadle. "Please your honour," says he, "here is a very queer fellow come to town. I don't rightly know what to make of him." "Show him in," said the mayor, and in he stepped. A queer fellow truly, for there wasn't a colour of the rainbow but you might find it in some corner of his dress, and he was tall and thin, and had keen piercing eyes.
"I'm called the Pied Piper," he began, "and pray what might you be willing to pay me if I rid you of every single rat in Franchville?"
Well, much as they feared the rats, they feared parting with their money more, and fain would they have higgled and haggled, but the piper was not a man to stand nonsense, and the upshot was that £50 were promised him, and it meant a lot of money in those old days, as soon as not a rat was left to squeak or scurry in Franchville. Out of the hall stepped the piper, and as he stepped he laid his pipe to his lips, and a shrill, keen tune sounded through street and house. And as each note pierced the air, you might have seen a strange sight, for out of every hole the rats came tumbling. There were none too old, and none too young, none too big, and none too little, to crowd at the piper's heels, and with eager feet and upturned noses to patter after him as he paced the streets. Nor was the piper unmindful of the little toddling ones, for every 50 yards he'd stop and give an extra flourish on his pipe, just to give them time to catch up with the older and stronger of the band. Up Silver Street he went, and down Gold Street, and at the end of Gold Street is the harbour and the broad Solent beyond. And as he paced along, slowly and gravely, the townsfolk flocked to door and window, and many a blessing they called down upon his head. As for getting near him, there were too many rats. And now that he was at the water's edge, he stepped into a boat, and not a rat, as he shoved off into deep water, piping shrilly all the while, but followed him, plashing, paddling, and wagging their tails with delight. On and on he played and played, until the tide went down, and each master rat sank deeper and deeper in the slimy ooze of the harbour, until every mother's son of them was dead and smothered. The tide rose again, and the piper stepped on shore, but never a rat followed. You might fancy the townsfolk had been throwing up their caps and hurrahing, and stopping up rat holes, and setting the church bells a-ringing. But when the piper stepped ashore, and not so much as a single squeak was to be heard, the mayor and the council, and the townsfolk generally, began to hum and to haw and to shake their heads, for the town money chest had been sadly emptied of late, and where was the £50 to come from? Such an easy job, too. Just getting into a boat and playing a pipe. Why, the mayor himself could have done that if only he had thought of it. So he hummed and hawed, and at last,
"Come, my good man," said he, "you see what poor folk we are. How can we manage to pay you £50? Will you not take 20? When all is said and done, 'twill be good pay for all the trouble you've taken."
£50 was what I bargained for,
said the piper shortly.
and if I were you, I'd pay it quickly, for I can pipe many kinds of tunes, as folk sometimes find to their cost.
"Would you threaten us, you strolling vagabond?"
shrieked the mayor, and at the same time he winked to the council.
"The rats are all dead and drowned,"
muttered he, and so,
"you may do your worst, my good man."
And with that he turned short upon his heel.
"Very well,"
said the piper, and he smiled a quiet smile. With that he laid his pipe to his lips afresh, but now there came forth no shrill notes, as it were, of scraping and gnawing, and squeaking and scurrying, but the tune was joyous and resonant, full of happy laughter and merry play. And as he paced down the street, the elders mocked. But from schoolroom and playroom, from nursery and workshop, not a child but ran out with eager glee and shout, following gaily at the piper's call. Dancing, laughing, joining hands and tripping feet, the bright throng moved along up Gold Street and down Silver Street, and beyond Silver Street lay the cool green forest, full of old oaks and wide-spreading beeches. In and out among the oak trees you might catch glimpses of the piper's many-colored coat. You might hear the laughter of the children break and fade and die away as deeper and deeper into the lone green wood the stranger went and the children followed. All the while the elders watched and waited. They mocked no longer now. And watch and wait as they might, never did they set their eyes again upon the piper in his party-colored coat. Never were their hearts gladdened by the song and dance of the children issuing forth from amongst the ancient oaks of the forest. End of The Pied Piper.
Princess of Canterbury. There lived formerly in the county of Cumberland a nobleman who had 3 sons, 2 of whom were comely and clever youths, but the other a natural fool named Jack, who was generally engaged with the sheep. He was dressed in a party-coloured coat and a steeple-crowned hat with a tassel, as became his condition. Now the King of Canterbury had a beautiful daughter, who was distinguished by her great ingenuity and wit, and he issued a decree that whoever should answer 3 questions put to him by the princess should have her in marriage, and be heir to the crown at his decease. Shortly after this decree was published, news of it reached the ears of the nobleman's sons, and the 2 clever ones determined to have a trial, but they were sadly at a loss to prevent their idiot brother from going with them. They could not by any means get rid of him, and were compelled at length to let Jack accompany them. They had not gone far before Jack shrieked with laughter, saying, "I've found an egg!" "Put it in your pocket," said the brothers. A little while afterwards he burst out into another fit of laughter on finding a crooked hazel stick, which he also put in his pocket, and a third time he again laughed extravagantly because he found a nut. That also was put with his other treasures. When they arrived at the palace, they were immediately admitted on mentioning the nature of their business, and were ushered into a room where the princess and her suite were sitting. Jack, who never stood on ceremony, bawled out, "What a troop of fair ladies we've got here!" "Yes," said the princess, "we are fair ladies, for we carry fire in our bosoms." "Do you?" said Jack. "Then roast me an egg," pulling out the egg from his pocket. "How will you get it out again?" said the princess. "With a crooked stick," replied Jack, producing the hazel. "Where did that come from?" said the princess. "From a nut," answered Jack, pulling out the nut from his pocket. "I've answered the 3 questions, and now I'll have the lady." "No, no," said the king, "not so fast. You have still an ordeal to go through. You must come here in a week's time and watch for 1 whole night with the princess, my daughter. If you can manage to keep awake the whole night long, you shall marry her the next day." "But if I can't?" said Jack. "Then off goes your head," said the king. "But you need not try unless you like." Well, Jack went back home for a week and thought over whether he should try and win the princess. At last he made up his mind. "Well," said Jack, "I'll try my vorten zo now for the king's daughter or a headless shepherd." And taking his bottle and bag, he trudged to the court. In his way thither he was obliged to cross a river, and pulling off his shoes and stockings, while he was passing over, he observed several pretty fish bobbing against his feet. So he caught some and put them into his pocket. When he reached the palace, he knocked at the gate loudly with his crook, and having mentioned the object of his visit, he was immediately conducted to the hall where the king's daughter sat ready, prepared to see her lovers. He was placed in a luxurious chair, and rich wines and spices were set before him, and all sorts of delicate meats. Jack, unused to such fare, ate and drank plentifully, so that he was nearly dozing before midnight. "Oh, shepherd," said the lady, "I have caught you napping." "No, sweet ally, I was busy a-fishing." "A-fishing," said the princess in the utmost astonishment. "Nay, shepherd, there is no fish-pond in the hall." "No matter for that. I have been fishing in my pocket, and have just caught one." "Oh, me!" said she, "let me see it." The shepherd slyly drew the fish out of his pocket, and, pretending to have caught it, showed it to her, and she declared it was the finest she ever saw. About half an hour afterwards she said, "Shepherd, do you think you could get me one more?" He replied, "Mayhap I may, when I have baited my hook." And after a little while he brought out another, which was finer than the first, and the princess was so delighted that she gave him leave to go to sleep, and promised to excuse him to her father. In the morning the princess told the king, to his great astonishment, that Jack must not be beheaded, for he had been fishing in the hall all night. But when he heard how Jack had caught such beautiful fish out of his pocket, he asked him to catch one in his own. Jack readily undertook the task, and bidding the king lie down, he pretended to fish in his pocket, having another fish concealed ready in his hand. And giving him a sly prick with a needle, he held up the fish and showed it to the king. His Majesty did not much relish the operation, but he assented to the marvel of it, and the princess and Jack were united the same day, and lived for many years in happiness and prosperity. End of Princess of Canterbury.
Tamlane. Young Tamlane was the son of Earl Murray, and Burd Janet was the daughter of Dunbar, Earl of March. And when they were young they loved one another, and plighted their troth. But when the time came near for their marrying, Tamlane disappeared, and none knew what had become of him. Many, many days after he had disappeared, Burd Janet was wandering in the Carterhaugh woods, though she had been warned not to go there. And as she wandered, she plucked the flowers from the bushes. She came at last to a bush of broom, and began plucking it. She had not taken more than 3 flowerets, when by her side up started young Tamlane. "Where come ye from, Tamlane, Tamlane?" Burd Janet said, "and why have you been away so long?" "From Elfland I come," said young Tamlane. "The Queen of Elfland has made me her knight." "But how did you get there, Tamlane?" said Burd Janet. "I was hunting one day, and as I rode widdershins round yon hill, a deep drowsiness fell upon me, And when I awoke, behold, I was in Elfland. Fair is that land and gay, and fain would I stop, but for thee and one other thing. Every 7 years the elves pay their tithe to the netherworld, and for all the queen makes much of me, I fear it is myself that will be the tithe. Oh, can you not be saved? Tell me if aught I can do will save you, Tamlane. Only one thing is there for my safety. Tomorrow night is Halloween, and the fairy court will then ride through England and Scotland. And if you would borrow me from Elfland, you must take your stand by Miles Cross between 12 and 1 of the night, and with holy water in your hand you must cast a compass all around you. But how shall I know you, Tamlane, quoth Burd Janet, amid so many knights I've ne'er seen before? The first court of elves that come by let pass. The next court you shall pay reverence to, but do naught nor say aught. But the third court that comes by is the chief court of them, and at the head rides the queen of all Elfland. And I shall ride by her side upon a milk-white steed, with a star in my crown. They give me this honour as being a christened knight. Watch my hands, Janet. The right one will be gloved, but the left one will be bare, and by that token you will know me. But how to save you, Tamlane? Quoth Burd Janet. You must spring upon me suddenly, and I will fall to the ground. Then seize me quick, and whatever change befall me, for they will exercise all their magic on me, cling hold to me till they turn me into red-hot iron. Then cast me into this pool, and I will be turned back into a mother-naked man. Cast then your green mantle over me, and I shall be yours, and be of the world again. So Burd Janet promised to do all for Tamlane, and at the next night, at midnight, she took her stand by Miles Cross, and cast a compass about her with holy water. Soon there came riding by the elfin court. First over the mound went a troop on black steeds, and then another troop on brown. But in the third court, all on milk-white steeds, she saw the Queen of Elfland, and by her side a knight with a star in his crown, with right hand gloved and the left bare. Then she knew this was her own Tamlane, and springing forward she seized the bridle of the milk-white steed and pulled its rider down. And as soon as he had touched the ground, she let go the bridle and seized him in her arms. "He's won! He's won amongst us all!" shrieked out the eldritch crew, and all came around her and tried their spells on young Tamlane. First they turned him in Janet's arms like frozen ice, then into a huge flame of roaring fire. Then again the fire vanished, and an adder was skipping through her arms. But still she held on, and then they turned him into a snake that reared up as if to bite her, and yet she held on. Then suddenly a dove was struggling in her arms, and almost flew away. Then they turned him into a swan, but all was in vain, till at last he was turned into a red-hot glaive, and this she cast into a well of water, and then he turned back into a mother-naked man. She quickly cast her green mantle over him, and young Tamlane was Burd Janet's forever. Then sang the Queen of Elfland, as the court turned away and began to resume its march. She that has borrowed young Tamlane has gotten a stately groom. She's taken away my bonniest knight, left nothing in his room. But had I known, Tamlane, Tamlane, a lady would borrow thee, I'd ha' ta'en out thy 2 grey eyne, put in 2 eyne of 3. Had I but known, Tamlane, Tamlane, before we came from home, I'd ha' ta'en out thy heart of flesh, put in a heart of stone. Had I but had the wit yestreen that I have got today, I'd paid the fiend 7 times his teind ere you'd be won away. And then the elfin court rode away, and Bird Janet and young Tamlane went their way homewards, and were soon after married, after young Tamlane had again been sained by the holy water, and made Christian once more. End of Tamlane.
The 3 Cows. There was a farmer, and he had 3 cows. Fine fat beauties they were. One was called Facey, the other Diamond, and the third Beauty. One morning he went into his cowshed, and there he found Facey so thin that the wind would have blown her away. Her skin hung loose about her, all her flesh was gone, and she stared out of her great eyes as though she'd seen a ghost. And what was more, the fireplace in the kitchen was one great pile of wood ash. Well, he was bothered with it. He could not see how all this had come about. Next morning his wife went out to the shed, and see! Diamond was for all the world as wished a looking creature as Facey. Nothing but a bag of bones, all the flesh gone, and half a rick of wood was gone too. But the fireplace was piled up 3 feet high with white wood ashes. The farmer determined to watch the 3rd night, so he hid in a closet which opened out of the parlor, and he left the door just ajar, that he might see what passed. Tick, tick went the clock, and the farmer was nearly tired of waiting. He had to bite his little finger to keep himself awake, when suddenly the door of his house flew open, and in rushed maybe 1,000 pixies, laughing and dancing and dragging at Beauty's halter, till they had brought the cow into the middle of the room. The farmer really thought he should have died with fright, and so perhaps he would, had not curiosity kept him alive. Tick, tick went the clock, but he did not hear it now. He was too intent staring at the pixies and his last beautiful cow. He saw them throw her down, fall on her, and kill her. Then with their knives they ripped her open, and flayed her clean as a whistle. Then out ran some of the little people and brought in firewood, and made a roaring blaze on the hearth. And there they cooked the flesh of the cow. They baked and they boiled, they stewed and they fried. "Take care," cried one, who seemed to be the king. "Let no bone be broken." Well, when they had all eaten, and had devoured every scrap of beef on the cow, they began playing games with the bones, tossing them one to another. One little leg bone fell close to the closet door, and the farmer was so afraid lest the pixies should come there and find him in their search for the bone, that he put out his hand and drew it into him. Then he saw the king stand on the table and say, "Gather the bones!" Round and round flew the imps, picking up the bones. "Arrange them," said the king, and they placed them all in their proper positions in the hide of the cow. Then they folded the skin over them, and the king struck the heap of bone and skin with his rod. Whisht! Up sprang the cow, and lo, dismally, it was alive again. But, alas! As the pixies dragged it back to its stall, it halted in the off forefoot, for a bone was missing. The cock crew, away they flew, and the farmer crept trembling to bed. End of the 3 Cows.
The Three Sillies. Once upon a time there was a farmer and his wife, who had one daughter, and she was courted by a gentleman. Every evening he used to come and see her, and stop to supper at the farmhouse, and the daughter used to be sent down into the cellar to draw the beer for supper. So one evening she had gone down to draw the beer, and she happened to look up at the ceiling while she was drawing, and she saw a mallet stuck in one of the beams. It must have been there a long, long time, but somehow or other she had never noticed it before, and she began a-thinking. And she thought it was very dangerous to have that mallet there, for she said to herself, Suppose him and me was to be married, and we was to have a son, and he was to grow up to be a man, and come down into the cellar to draw the beer, like as I'm doing now, and the mallet was to fall on his head and kill him. What a dreadful thing it would be!" And she put down the candle and the jug, and sat herself down and began a-crying. Well, they began to wonder upstairs how it was that she was so long drawing the beer, and her mother went down to see after her, and she found her sitting on the settle crying, and the beer running over the floor. "Why, whatever is the matter?" said her mother. "Oh, mother," says she, "look at that horrid mallet. Suppose we was to be married, and was to have a son, and he was to grow up, and was to come down to the cellar to draw the beer, and the mallet was to fall on his head and kill him. What a dreadful thing it would be!" "Dear, dear, what a dreadful thing it would be!" said the mother, and she sat her down aside of the daughter, and started a-crying too. Then after a bit the father began to wonder that they didn't come back, and he went down into the cellar to look after them himself, and there they two sat a-crying, and the beer running all over the floor. "Whatever is the matter?" says he. "Why," says the mother, "look at that horrid mallet. Just suppose if our daughter and her sweetheart was to be married, and was to have a son, and he was to grow up, and was to come down into the cellar to draw the beer, and the mallet was to fall on his head and kill him. What a dreadful thing it would be!" "Dear, dear, dear, so it would," said the father, and he sat himself down aside of the other two, and started a-crying. Now the gentleman got tired of stopping up in the kitchen by himself, and at last he went down into the cellar too, to see what they were after. And there they three sat a-crying side by side, and the beer running all over the floor. And he ran straight and turned the tap. Then he said, "Whatever are you three doing, sitting there crying, and letting the beer run all over the floor?" "Oh," says the father, "look at that horrid mallet. Suppose you and our daughter was to be married, and was to have a son, and he was to grow up, and was to come down into the cellar to draw the beer, and the mallet was to fall on his head and kill him." And then they all started a-crying worse than before. But the gentleman burst out a-laughing, and reached up and pulled out the mallet. And then he said, "I've travelled many miles, and I never met three such big sillies as you three before. And now I shall start out on my travels again, and when I can find three bigger sillies than you three, then I'll come back and marry your daughter." So he wished them good-bye, and started off on his travels, and left them all crying because the girl had lost her sweetheart. Well, he set out and he travelled a long way, and at last he came to a woman's cottage that had some grass growing on the roof. And the woman was trying to get her cow to go up a ladder to the grass, and the poor thing durst not go. So the gentleman asked the woman what she was doing. "Why, look ye," she said, "look at all that beautiful grass. I'm going to get the cow onto the roof to eat it. She'll be quite safe, for I shall tie a string round her neck, and pass it down the chimney, and tie it to my wrist as I go about the house, so she can't fall off without my knowing it." "Oh, you poor silly," said the gentleman, "you should cut the grass and throw it down to the cow." But the woman thought it was easier to get the cow up the ladder than to get the grass down. So she pushed her and coaxed her, and got her up, and tied a string round her neck, and passed it down the chimney, and fastened it to her own wrist. And the gentleman went on his way. But he hadn't gone far when the cow tumbled off the roof, and hung by the string tied round her neck, and it strangled her. And the weight of the cow tied to her wrist pulled the woman up the chimney, and she stuck fast half way, and was smothered in soot. Well, That was one big silly. And the gentleman went on, and he went to an inn to stop the night, and they were so full at the inn that they had to put him in a double-bedded room, and another traveller was to sleep in the other bed. The other man was a very pleasant fellow, and they got very friendly together. But in the morning, when they were both getting up, the gentleman was surprised to see the other hang his trousers on the knobs of the chest of drawers, and run across the room and try to jump into them. And he tried over and over again, and couldn't manage it. And the gentleman wondered whatever he was doing it for. At last he stopped and wiped his face with his handkerchief. "Oh dear," he says, "I do think trousers are the most awkwardest kind of clothes that ever were. I can't think who could have invented such things. It takes me the best part of an hour to get into mine every morning, and I get so hot. How do you manage yours?" So the gentleman burst out a-laughing, and showed him how to put them on, and he was very much obliged to him, and said he never should have thought of doing it that way. So that was another big silly. Then the gentleman went on his travels again, and he came to a village, and outside the village there was a pond, and round the pond was a crowd of people, and they had got rakes and brooms and pitchforks, reaching into the pond. And the gentleman asked what was the matter. "Why," they said, "matter enough. Moon's tumbled into the pond, and we can't rake her out anyhow." So the gentleman burst out a-laughing, and told them to look up into the sky, and that it was only the shadow in the water. But they wouldn't listen to him, and abused him shamefully, and he got away as quick as he could. So there was a whole lot of sillies, bigger than them 3 sillies at home. So the gentleman turned back home again, and married the farmer's daughter, and if they didn't live happy for ever after, that's nothing to do with you or me.